On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, possible breakthrough at the G20 summit, the meeting between President Xi and Mr. Trump, and severely hit by high costs from tariffs. How are industries coping with an escalating trade war?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. China and the U.S., the two biggest economies on opposite sides of the Pacific, have had their ups and downs. It's been a bumpy road since U.S. President Donald Trump became tougher on China with the ongoing trade frictions, tensions in the South China Sea, and disagreements on regional issues. They do get the chance to sort it out, though, face to face, when they meet on the sidelines of the G20 summit. What's in store for the most important bilateral relations in the world? Take a look.
It all went well between China and the U.S. under the new Trump administration. In April last year, he invited President Xi for a leaders' summit in his own Mar-a-Lago resort. The two had great talks in a friendly atmosphere, addressing China's concern on Mr. Trump's unfriendly words during his campaign.
Really liked him. We had a great chemistry, I think. I mean, at least I had a great chemistry. Maybe he didn't like me, but I think he liked me.
The bilateral ties strengthened later that year at the G20 meeting in Germany, as well as Mr. Trump's state visit to China, when the two sides agreed on more dialogues and negotiations to fix misunderstandings. But things went south since the beginning of 2018. In his national address, the U.S. president accused China of intellectual property violations and unfair trade practices.
And rivals like China and Russia that challenge our interests, our economy, and our values.
The back and forth, slapping tariffs on each other, came to a head with a full-on trade war between the world's two largest economies. The disagreement emerged as China stood its ground, defending open and free global trade.
Mankind has once again reached at a crossroads. Which direction should we choose? Cooperation or confrontation? Openness or closing one's door? Win-win progress or a zero-sum game? The interest of all countries and indeed the future of mankind hinge on the choice we make.
Tensions between China and the U.S. also spilled over in the South China Sea disputes. U.S. interference on China's Taiwan affairs and other regional security issues like the Korean Peninsula denuclearization. These issues have topped the agenda at the second China-U.S. diplomatic and security dialogue 2 weeks ago. High-ranking officials from both sides spoke highly of the strategic leading role of the two presidents' diplomacy in the bilateral ties. And early this month, President Xi and Mr. Trump have agreed during their telephone conversation for a meeting at the G20 summit in Argentina to work for new progress based on healthy and stable development of relations. Many are anticipating that this year's G20 will be no routine gathering, with a pressing need to allay fears on China-U.S. relations.
So what defines current relations between China and the U.S.? Let's loop in our panelists. We have a very strong panel. In Beijing, we have Wang Yong, who is a professor at the School of International Studies of Peking University. Also with us in Beijing, Zhang Gong, professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. In Washington, D.C., we have two guests joining us. Mary Lovely, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, also a professor of economics, and Melvin Eggers, faculty scholar at the Syracuse University. Meanwhile, we have in New York Cheng Li, the director and senior fellow at the John Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to all of you. I want to start by asking you, Dr. Li, very briefly, but certainly a very unpredictable answer, I hope, coming from different panelists. What about the deal or no deal, when the two heads of state meeting on the sideline of the G20?
That's the question, but also related to or actually 3 other questions. First, whether these 2 leaders want to have a deal. This is number 1, because they need to do a calculation based on their domestic and international environment, their assessment. Secondly, whether they are able to make a deal. For China, of course, Chinese leaders are willing to compromise on the economic front, but they are not going to compromise on the security and the strategic front at a time when the United States treats China as a strategic rivalry or even as enemy, and also that there's a lot of strong criticism, talk about or concerns or kind of strategic approach to contain China, etc. So that's created difficulties for Xi Jinping. For Donald Trump, of course, the Americans also that quite divided. He needs to address the issues with his own bureaucracy and American interest group. And then finally, whether the deal will last, if there's a deal, I think it's almost for sure that the deal will not resolve all the problem. But having said that, all these things, I think there's an incentive for 2 top leaders to cut a deal, because you cannot just endlessly let this kind of trade conflict continue. It will be everyone's lose. So they also understand that eventually, if in this area you cannot see cooperation, they will be also very, very bad for the stability and regional security. So the stake is very high. The chance for deal is there.
Okay. Well, Dr. Li, I have to say, that's your logic, that if there is no agreement between the 2 sides, things are getting worse for all. But we do not know whether that's the logic of some of the others who are making the decisions. So Professor Wang here in Beijing, you want to respond to your colleague, Dr. Li's predictions, or shall I say 3 different questions?
I echo Dr. Li's point. My guess is that nobody knows. Okay, what's the result? There will be, okay, from the G20, the leaders' meeting. I think the best scenario would be, I think, 50-50. Yeah, so I think only one person knows the results. That's President Trump. Yeah, so I think to him and to his team around him, it's very important to readjust their perceptions about China, about the interest distributions of the U.S.-China economic relations. So I think that is a very misleading to define China as a strategic rivalry.
You've been hearing a lot, Professor Lovely, in D.C., so-called a paradigm change in terms of U.S.-China relations. Whether that is really a paradigm change or a man-made paradigm change, we do not know. So from your perspective as an economist, trade and economic ties certainly used to be the pillar, but now it's being put into question mark. Professor Lovely, a deal or no deal, what kinds of possibility can the 2 leaders work on?
Well, I think we may see a deal, but it will probably be a shallow deal in the sense that the best we can hope for really is an agreement to continue talks on a deeper level. The economic relationship has been a pillar of the relationship, and I think the fact that the economic relationship right now is in peril indicates that we're at a critical time for the relationship. And a sign that the economic conflict is being addressed successfully would be a sign that perhaps there will be a way forward. What the deeper question is really if President Xi's vision for China is consistent with an Asia structure that the U.S. can also live with.
Of course, as an economist yourself, also, Professor Gong, you have your own thoughts about the possibility and the outcomes. Professor Lovely put it wonderfully, saying that it could be an agreement to work on the future possibilities. What about from you?
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with Mary. Mary used the word shadow deal. I call it truce probably. I think they're going to reach something. I'm probably more optimistic than some other panelists here. I think there are some signs, for example...
You're looking at Professor Wang very attentively. What are you trying to suggest here? Okay.
Well, I mean, his economic advisor clearly came out to say that, there's going to be a deal, right? So I think there are some signs that, and also another signs that the 2 sides are actually talking. But the problem is that the demands from the United States just cannot be really addressed very shortly. It's going to take time, and it's all going to have to go through the process here in China as well. So I think in that aspect, it's not something that you can just sit down and sign it. So I think it's going to be something. I call it a truce that they're going to continue to implement the things they're going to reach.
Right.
And the results will depend on whether how good both sides be implementing these agreements. I think we've gone through this once already. I mean, we had when Donald Trump first came to power, we had this 100-day negotiation. I remember that, and we came up with agreement. But obviously, the American side are not very satisfied. It's not very satisfied with that.
So, Dr. Li, let's just talk pragmatism here. Okay, so what's likely to be the timeline and the agenda on both sides that would likely to influence their temporary result when it comes to this discussion? Dr. Li, 2 years from now, presidential election. Midterm election, Mr. Trump seemed to get okay. And meanwhile, he is someone very alerted by the stock market result. We saw something in October. And at the same time, the feedbacks as a result of the trade discussions, particularly from the Midwest. So, Dr. Li, to you, what kind of timeline and schedule is he looking at, domestically speaking?
Well, two things. First is, actually you mentioned, one is his own scandal investigations. There are a lot of these things going on in the United States, even today, that he accused that Mueller as McCarthyism. Of course, no one will take that seriously, that what his accusation. But that tells you that he is in big trouble in that regard. So he will be driven by his own interests. Secondly, it's the U.S. economy, as you mentioned about stock market, but also real kind of possibility that the American economy will face some challenges. So, of course, at the moment, the American economy is relatively well, but things could go wrong. So these are the two factors will shape his agenda and shape his policy towards China. Now, also regarding China, he also faces a dilemma. On the one hand, at the moment, there's a lot of criticism of China by various interest groups and also by U.S. media. But at the same time, you should not go too far to really treat China as enemy, because this is really something too big. That makes these two countries in a terrible shape for even a military conflict. So American people are not ready for that. So he needs to be careful. So this also will affect how he will look at China and also play the China card.
Right. That's politically and geopolitically speaking. When it comes to economics, Professor Lovely, you see two things going on right now. Quite a number of things coming out of statistics. For example, the trade deficit of the United States is not falling, but rather rising, even as a result of the tariffs put on by the president and his cabinet. And secondly, you see this fierce debate between him and the Fed chairman, pointing fingers almost. Obviously, it is the real economy that we are talking about here. Professor Lovely, how are you reading these signs, and what does that mean to your understanding in a decision-making process for the current administration?
Well, the expanding trade deficit is something that most economists expected once we had such a large tax cut. So it's certainly no surprise to most of the economic community. The verbal spats between really all one way on Donald Trump against the Fed chairman are also not really a surprise. They don't really have much effect on how the Fed behaves. So I think we have a very solid foundation for independence of the Fed. I think all that is sort of noise. Underneath, I agree that the relationship between these two countries is much too important to be cavalier about a trade war. Having said that, a weakened Donald Trump does not mean that America will be able to resolve these conflicts with China easily.
No.
I think support for a more aggressive approach to China, especially on the intellectual property issues, tech transfer issues, runs very deep in both parties, and I think that it would be a mistake to think that, simply Mueller giving President Trump a hard time is going to resolve it. It's not. The negotiators need to roll up their sleeves and come to really try to find where cooperation can be made.
And they need to have the ambience to be able to roll up their sleeves and in order to negotiate among themselves from both sides. Professor Gong, let me go to you about that too. If you look at China, the overall China-U.S. relationship is one of the important components of where China wants it to go.
Right.
At the very beginning of China's reform and opening up, back in the 1970s,
Right.
this is a conscious choice China made about the direction of the country. And now you see that component is being put a temporary question mark. So what does that mean for China's continued drive of reform and opening up, which China has been very strongly committed to by many leaders in this current administration, once and again. So what does that mean?
I think China certainly doesn't want to leave this economic order here. We benefited immensely from it since we joined WTO 17 years ago. So I think that China will continue to benefit from it. This is not just one way. The United States also benefiting immensely from the cooperative economic relations between these two countries. I think right now is a matter of whether the Trump administration is really trying to persuade China to change certain behaviors in the trade practices or so-called distortionary trade practices, or is it really bent on kicking China out of the current order?
Right.
I think there's a quite distinction here.
If it was the latter, I'm just saying, if it was the latter, what would that mean for China and the United States and the rest of the world?
Oh, this is going to be a huge implication for China as well as the rest of the world. That means that now we're really talking about this curtain now. This curtain. We're going to get into essentially two systems here, two clouds here. One is an American-led, American-centric system, where the other one is the China-centric sort of a trading bloc. And this is this is the equivalent of an economic Cold War we're talking about here. And this is not going to bode well for both countries, as well as for peace for the entire world.
So actually the cake will be cut into pieces in which it's smaller than the original anyway for everybody.
Oh, it's going to be, everybody's not going to do well if we're getting to down that path.
I see. But Professor Wang, but what if it was the choice, consciously or unconsciously, for whatever reason, coming from the current administration? Of course, Professor Lovely earlier already argued very philosophically about the consensus in Washington toward China now. But if it is going the other way around, what would be the choices that China could make?
I think that is...
Of course, this is beyond just the G20 satellite meeting.
Yes. I think that is a question, I think, to a lot of people. Right, so a lot of people thinking the U.S.-China relations is in the process of reorientation. As mainly in the economy, we have seen the signs of the economic decoupling. At least I call it the partial decoupling, which will taking place in the high-tech sectors. Right? So I think I'm very worried about the effects to both sides.
I see.
Because in the last 20 years, the economy, the U.S.-China has been including one single economy.
Right.
People call it China-America. That is economic reality. Both sides, as Professor Gong mentioned, that both sides benefit tremendously, and the whole world as well.
Right.
Now I think that is a lot of policy about China coming from the U.S. administration. I think that's crazy.
All right.
Yeah.
It's not only about just the bilateral relations. In fact, the two countries' relations as the biggest economies in the world will have a tremendous impact on the rest of the world, and also on the international governance as well. If we talk about the debate about WTO, IMF, and some of the other things. Chinese President Xi Jinping, though, over the years has been to the G20 summit since 2013. This year, President Xi would have stressed the need, as many believed, of multilateralism and inclusive growth. He advocates rules from the international community and also saying that G20 is like a bridge that bridges the people together. That's a quote coming from Chinese President Xi. Of course, Dr. Li, even about how international governance should be done, now we see different opinions coming from China and United States. And many wonder whether this would also be a place where the bilateral relations being played up on the international stage as well. What do you think, Dr. Li? Will that help the two countries to find common ground?
Well,
go ahead, sir.
Before answering your excellent question, I want to make a comment on Professor Gong's earlier remarks.
Please.
I largely agree with him about the fact that both U.S. and China benefit from WTO, from economic liberalization. As a country, that's the case. But in the United States, if you look at the different social groups, in the economic group, you see a large number of middle class and the poor people do not benefit that much from the economic liberalization. That explains Donald Trump phenomenon, why he got elected, why there's a populism in the United States. We should keep that in mind, not just treat that both countries benefit, then why you make noises, because this will overlook some important issues. I think probably Professor Gong also agree. I just want to modify that. But to answer your question, actually, I do believe that President Xi Jinping touched all the right buttons. Talk about multilateralism, talk about inclusive growth, talk about the economic liberalization, talk about a win-win, and etc. At a time when the United States, especially Donald Trump, only talk about unilateralism, talk about make America great again, and also domestically to adopt an anti-immigration policy. So as an American, I really feel worried about what's going on in the United States. I think this discourse should be a change. I think that the United States should play a more important role. These are the two major countries. This reminds me a kind of a very nice saying in American movie. With great power comes with great responsibility. I think this is a time to talk about the unilateralism, talk about responsibility of great power, such as United States and China.
Okay, Professor Wang, to talk about it is easy. But to really seek a common ground and be able to prosper the relationship as a result of searching for common ground, that's totally requiring a different set of tools and capabilities. Professor Wang, are the two countries now and the bureaucracy capable of doing that?
Okay, before I touch on your question,
all right.
The comments cutting back to,
all right, very
Dr.
briefly,
Li, Dr. Li's the points on this. So I think, yeah, I agree that the both sides benefit from the economic relations. That is, but we have to remember that economic globalization has its dark side. The main problem is taking place in the domestic politics. U.S. engaged in the Middle East intervention. Otherwise, I think there is some mismanaged domestic policies to deal with the negative sides of the economic globalizations. So I think the responses for the challenges should, first of all, comes from the domestic policy adjustment. Not just to blame the others for all the problems the U.S. has.
All right, then. We have a lot of debates about this already earlier. So let's just put that aside and talk about pragmatism. So you think the two economies will be able to have the tool sets and the willingness to find common ground? If there are, what could be these common grounds? Professor Wang, very directly, please.
Yes. I will say infrastructure. The U.S. now is Donald Trump promise to strengthen the infrastructure in the United States. I think he's in the right directions. But by now, I think they're still far away from meeting the commitment. China can help.
Okay. All right. Professor Lovely, your time to talk. Very briefly, also, ma'am.
So, listening to President Xi's speeches, I think we do hear him hitting all the right notes. The problem is that when those notes are heard in America, people wonder if there's any force behind them. So America does have a responsibility. With great power does come responsibility. I completely agree with that. However, we look at China and saying China has become a great power again. Where is it? How is it meeting its responsibilities? I believe that there is a strong view in America that it has not lived up to some of its commitments that were made in its accession to the WTO.
Right.
So we have on both sides an unwillingness.
Yeah, but Professor, if I can, also humbly the same question. If there is common ground, where is it?
Well, it's certainly, we've already seen China unilaterally reduce tariffs. They can open further in terms of services. They can begin to provide information that shows that the intellectual property courts that President Xi has instituted are actually working. I think there's a lot of ways in which China can, instead of sort of repelling the criticisms, actually show that changes are being made.
Okay.
So I think that many of these reforms are good for China, and China will be able to show that they are making progress.
All right. I see Professor Lovely holding on to her original thoughts. And Professor Gong, before we go, briefly from you as well, if there is common ground, what could be this common ground?
I think the real differences between the two sides are probably overblown. I mean, look at the demands from the United States, intellectual property right protection. I think we're committed to that. We already announced that, and we're going to follow up with that. In terms of state subsidies,
there are already policies before the G20 summit already. Yeah.
Right. So there are policies that are already starting to be introduced, and I think there'll be more commitments at the summit that China is going to do. So I think I totally agree with Mary that it's a matter of how we actually implement these commitments.
And it's how information is being transformed to different cultures and different sides of this debate. We hope information can be sufficiently provided to both sides about what each other will do in order to make it work. I want to thank the four of you so much in this already quite a comprehensive discussion, but I know there's a lot to be said. But you know what? We are going to wait for the summit to happen. After that, we're going to have more possibilities to go deeper about the bilateral relations. Thank you so much, the four of you. You care, and you certainly provide your insight. Really appreciate it. Wang Yong, Zhang Gong, Mary Lovely, last but certainly not least, Dr. Cheng Li. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Still to come on the program, World Insight. Severely hit by high costs from tariffs, how are industries coping with an escalating trade war? We will ask our panelists about the U.S. economy and its potential right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. U.S. side has slapped tariffs on imports from a range of trading partners, including China, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, prompting retaliation against U.S. exports. Tit-for-tat tariffs on U.S. products are having a profound impact on corporate America, especially hitting businesses and farmers, some say. President Trump says trade wars are easy to win, but who is really winning? That, of course, is a debate taking place both inside the United States and beyond. Here is the story.
Trump's trade policies were meant to protect U.S. domestic businesses, but it seems they're likely to be the worst affected. Companies and industries are already starting to feel the pinch. The tariffs are increasing input costs for the companies that import goods from China, making their operations less viable. The manufacturing activity in the U.S. slowed to the 6-month low in October. According to the data provided by the trading group, the Institute of Supply Management, the National Factory Index dropped over 2 percentage points to just above 57 in October. In a huge blow to Trump, General Motors on Monday announced plans to close 2 manufacturing plants in the U.S., axing over 14,000 jobs. The company did not specifically mention tariffs, but in June, GM warned that trade tariffs could lead to job losses and lower wages. U.S. industry figures are an aberration. Analysts believe that Trump's leverage game against China seems to be backfiring.
So far, that hasn't turned out to be the case.
One of the most striking consequences of the trade war is its impact on U.S. farmers. According to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune newspaper, over 80 farms have filed for bankruptcy in 5 U.S. states in the upper Midwest region. Corn, soybeans, milk, and beef producers are the worst affected due to the steep fall in global demand. China last year accounted for about 60% of the total U.S. soybean exports. Since Trump imposed sweeping tariffs prompting China to retaliate, prices for soybeans have plummeted to a 10-year low. According to data analyzed by Louisiana State University, in 2018, almost 15% of 2018 soybean produced in Louisiana is plowed under or is too damaged to sell. A rising trade deficit with China was at the core of Trump's trade war, but the latest numbers prove that raising duties on goods isn't helping. In September, the U.S. trade deficit with China reached a new high of over $34 billion, a 13% increase compared to last year. The Chinese side says it hopes that U.S. will realize the basic fact of an interconnected world. There are no winners in a trade war.
So what's the economic cost of trade tensions? Let's ask our academic experts. Still with us in Washington, D.C., once again, Mary Lovely, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. In the United States, we also have Steve Kyle, who is a professor of economics at Cornell University. Welcome, Professor. And in Southampton, the UK, we invited Mike Baskin, a professor at the University of Southampton. Welcome to all of you. This is not a debate about who will blink first when it comes to a trade war, not at all, but rather let's take a look at the numbers and take a look at the different sides of the economy. Professor Kyle, since you are joining the debate new, help us to understand, will the American businesses, particularly multinationals, be able to survive well the current atmosphere?
Well, it really depends which businesses you look at.
Exactly.
Overall, compared to the size of the U.S. economy, the costs are not huge. There are estimates out there of on the order of $120 to $130 per family per year, averaged over the whole country. But that really masks underlying pain in particular sectors and particular industries. Certainly, there are some industries with a healthy enough profit margin that they can absorb at least some of the increased costs. But there are others that are in deep trouble. I'm glad that I don't farm soybeans right now, just to take one example, and I'm glad that I don't run a business that buys aluminum and steel. If you're in that kind of a position, it can be serious trouble.
Right. However, Professor Lovely, I mean, the current administration is trying to provide subsidies to these farmers who are doing soybeans, and also try to provide what they consider as good conditions for the steel industry. Of course, one could argue, how long will this last? That's another question. And what's going to happen after that? What do you think? Will political, measures and policies driven the economy, some of the sectors, be able to be stable?
Well, I mean, you're asking about the economic and the politics. On the political side, I think, we saw many of the same districts who voted for President Trump return Republican congressmen to Congress. Many farmers are staying with Trump, even though they themselves are feeling a lot of pain. I think it's really a matter of how long this lasts. The subsidy program for farmers is really just a stopgap. It's just a tiny Band-Aid on the wound. The longer this goes on, clearly the deeper that pain, and clearly the harder it is politically for President Trump to sustain this. So we're seeing not only multinationals are going to bear some of the costs, it's hitting also small and medium enterprises who buy things from China, as well as our farmers.
Right. Professor Kyle, we see that the numbers of the U.S. economy are doing quite well, one would argue, over the past few years. But on the other hand, you see also the Fed, as we mentioned earlier in our earlier round of debate, trying to adjust its policy, the interest rates, and also as a result and related to that, whether future tax cuts will be done and to what degree. By what time? How many times? So these are all profound economic questions that needs to be asked when you look at the real potential of the U.S. economy, particularly in the midterm, not just the next year, but rather in the next few years. Professor Kyle, your thought?
Well, it's certainly true that the U.S. economy has been doing well, and it's likely that we're nearing a peak of the business cycle in the next year or two, although no one can predict with any certainty. As for the effects of the tariffs themselves, if we look to the longer term, the intention is to promote replacement production in the United States in place of the imported goods. That, however, is itself questionable. If I were a factory owner or an owner of a business and were looking to locate a new factory, I certainly would not want to choose a country that is starting to engage in a trade war. I would want to pick somewhere else that I could freely export and import from and to. If you look at our own businesses, the Harley-Davidson motorcycle company, for example, moved production from the United States to another country for precisely that reason. So I worry about the long-run effects of this as well as the short run, whereas numerous commentators have said nobody is winning.
Right. Professor Lovely, I have to come back to you once again, too. I mean, you see one company after another. Harley-Davidson is one of them, General Motors, another one, and you also see now the latest news related to Apple. So one after another, what would these companies actually mean? And also the debate related to them mean for the future directions of the economic policy choices?
Well, you're asking questions that reflect the fact that we're moving into territory we haven't been in before. But, you know, clearly it's time for the business community to send up some smoke signals that this is really hurting them. I believe it's also hurting factories in China. We're seeing U.S. buyers trying to squeeze Chinese suppliers. That hurts their margins. It hurts their ability to hire workers. So again, we see neither side gains. Where do we go from here? Well, we're hoping that this weekend we get the beginning of a détente and we get some relief from these tariffs and begin to return to the table and talk about expanding market access and expanding the interconnectedness of the two economies, which has been beneficial to both sides.
Just adding to the complication there, you know, if we take a look at some of the consumer markets, there was certainly something very different now as being reported. There was something missing at the luxury jewelry stores, Tiffany & Co. in recent months. For example, Chinese tourists have been rather going down the number, and the revenue has been suffering as a result of this, if you take a look at the numbers over there on the screen. And this is certainly just one of those examples, and Chinese consumers are certainly trying to, in their own way, make their voices heard as well. So, Professor Bastian, you are coming from Europe. Of course, Europe has its own challenges, to say the least, for now. But certainly, it's also one of the huge block of economies, that's likely to be influenced as a result of this trade dispute going on between the two largest economies in the world, China and the United States. Professor Bastian.
Well, most definitely. I think I echo the sentiments that have been made, that there is really no winners, and I think those losers don't just include China and the U.S., they include Europe, which has its own pressures as well. I think what I will say is that at the summit, the upcoming G20 summit, let's be positive, and let's hope that there is some sort of meeting, some sort of public handshake between Trump and President Xi Jinping, and we start to move forward to positive rhetoric and move away from the nationalistic, isolationistic sort of rhetoric that has really come from the Americans, and the weekend can beckon in some sort of new dawn where we move forward.
Professor, from your perspective, what are some of the things that urgently need to be handled right now, and how are you looking at the potential near-term and middle-term about the U.S. economy?
I think a lot of it hangs on the midterm elections.
Professor Bastian, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of it hangs really on Trump, and Trump's facing up to whether or not his rhetoric, his sort of China bashing rhetoric, really still resonates with the American public. As the panelists have said, it's perhaps only a matter of time before even the farmers and some of the other members of the U.S. electorate actually who voted for Trump do actually turn against him and realize that it really is economically damaging short-term and long-term. And in that situation, Trump, I think, will be forced to make a U-turn. So I think it really is up to the American public to show their discontent through the ballot box, and hopefully that will happen soon.
I see. In the earlier round of discussion, purely devoted to the bilateral relations, I asked every panelist about the common ground that the two sides could ever seek, if there is any. I would like to ask that question to you once again about that question, because it's very crucial. Professor Kyle, economically speaking, the field for the better potential of both economies, where could be the common ground, sir?
Well, I have absolutely no question that if you got a group of United States economists together with a group of Chinese economists, that they could readily come up with a deal that made both sides happier. Certainly in the previous presidential administration here, there were deals on cybersecurity. There was progress on talks about intellectual property rights. I have no doubt that there could be more progress made in those areas. But the president's current moves toward trade war are not based on any of those considerations. They're based, it would seem, on purely domestic political considerations. So I'm not a psychiatrist, nor am I a political scientist. So I think it is an open question whether Mr. Trump will be willing to come to some sort of a deal with China in the upcoming summit.
All right. And Professor Bastin as well, briefly, sir.
I think it's for the economists. I also think it's for the business community, the American captains of industry, Chinese business leaders. If they can somehow coalesce and put pressure in effect on Trump and how they are all suffering, and they have a single voice and promote liberalization of trade agreements, and you know, a U-turn in Trump's attitude, I think that's the way forward. So it's for the business communities to unite.
Final words, Professor Lovely, you said it already, but final words from you once again, very briefly, ma'am.
Well, I think we need to focus on the issue of technology transfer and intellectual property.
Okay.
I think there's still an enormous amount of good to be gained for the world by U.S. and China working together.
All right. Mary Lovely, Stephen Kyle, Mike Bastin. I hope the leaders from both sides are listening to our conversation, and certainly they're going to get some inspirations as well. Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into a search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Me Tian Wei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night, everybody.